You held this phone. Almost everyone on Earth did. The Nokia 3310. Indestructible. A battery that lasted a week. A little green snake you chased across the screen for hours. And a ringtone so famous it is, to this day, one of the most played pieces of music in human history. This little brick sold 126 million times. But here is the part nobody tells you. The company that made it was not just a phone company. In the year 2000, Nokia was worth $250 billion. At its peak, it built 4 out of every 10 phones sold on the entire planet. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most dominant companies the world had ever seen. And then, in the space of about 6 years, it was gone. Not shrunk. Not struggling. Gone. Sold for parts to Microsoft, its name wiped off the phones it invented. When it was over, the men who ran Nokia stood in front of the cameras and said something that still haunts every boardroom on Earth. We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow, we lost. This is the story of how the most powerful phone company in history talked itself into extinction. How it saw the future coming, built that future in secret, and then buried it in a drawer. And how a single memo, comparing the whole company to a burning oil rig, lit the match on its own funeral. Because Nokia did not lose to a better phone. It lost to something far more dangerous. It lost to its own certainty that it could never lose. To understand how big the fall was, you have to understand where Nokia came from. Because it did not start in Silicon Valley. It started in a forest. In 1865, a mining engineer named Frederick Idestam built a paper mill on a river in southern Finland. The town was called Nokia. That was it. Pulp and paper, ground out of Finnish wood. Over the next century, that little mill became a strange, sprawling company that made almost everything. Rubber boots. Car tires. Raincoats. Electrical cable. Even toilet paper and television sets. If you had told a Finn in 1960 that Nokia would one day rule the world, they would have laughed. It made galoshes. But inside that messy conglomerate, a small electronics division was quietly learning how to move information through the air. Radios. Military equipment. Then, in the 1990s, a new leader made the most important bet in the company's history. His name was Jorma Ollila. He looked at the rubber and the paper and the cables, and he sold almost all of it. He bet the entire company on one idea. The mobile phone. It was an insane gamble. Mobile phones were expensive bricks for rich businessmen. But Ollila saw where the world was going before almost anyone else. And when a new European standard called GSM arrived, allowing phones to work across borders, Nokia was ready. In 1992, it launched the Nokia 1011, one of the first mass-market GSM phones. A Finnish company that used to make winter boots was about to put a phone in the pocket of every human being alive. What happened next was one of the fastest rises in business history. Nokia did something the American giants could not. It made phones that ordinary people actually wanted to hold. They were small. They were reliable. They were friendly. And crucially, they were cheap enough for the whole planet. In 1998, Nokia passed Motorola to become the largest mobile phone maker in the world. It would hold that crown for the next 14 years. Then came the phones that became legends. The 3210. The 3310. Phones so tough that today, decades later, people still joke that a Nokia could survive being run over by a truck. It gave the world Snake, the first mobile game most people ever played. It gave the world that ringtone, the Nokia tune, which by some counts was played more than 1 billion times a day. And it gave the world a slogan that said exactly what it believed it was doing. Connecting people. By the mid-2000s, Nokia was not just a company. In Finland, it was the economy. At its height, Nokia accounted for around 4% of the entire country's gross domestic product. It was the largest company on the Helsinki Stock Exchange by a mile. A quarter of Finland's economic growth in some years came from one firm. Finnish children grew up assuming they would work there. It paid the taxes that built the schools. A tiny, cold nation of 5 million people had produced the single most important technology company on Earth. And when you are that big, that dominant, that beloved, a dangerous idea starts to feel like a fact. The idea that no one can ever catch you. On January 9, 2007, a man in a black turtleneck walked onto a stage in San Francisco. Steve Jobs held up a slab of glass with no keyboard, no buttons, nothing but a screen you touched with your finger. He called it the iPhone. And in Finland, the reaction inside Nokia was not fear. It was amusement. Executives passed the iPhone around and listed everything wrong with it. The battery was terrible. It couldn't survive a drop. It had no real keyboard, and everyone knew serious people needed a keyboard. It sold in tiny numbers compared to Nokia's hundreds of millions. One Nokia leader reportedly called it a niche product. They were the champion. This was a toy. But here is the twist that makes Nokia's story a tragedy instead of just a failure. Nokia already knew. Years before the iPhone, Nokia engineers had built a phone with a large color touchscreen. They had built an early tablet with a wireless connection to the internet. They had even prototyped a system for buying things through the phone, years before the App Store. The future that Steve Jobs unveiled on that stage, Nokia had already invented in its own labs. And it had killed all of it. The projects were shelved. The prototypes went into drawers. Because inside a company that dominant, no one wants to hear that the thing making all the money is about to die. The engineers who pushed the touchscreen were seen as a threat to the business that already worked. Nokia did not lose because it couldn't see the future. It lost because it saw the future, and decided it was too risky to build. So why couldn't the giant just build a better phone and crush this upstart? Because inside Nokia, something had rotted. The problem had a name. Symbian. Symbian was the operating system that ran Nokia's phones, and in the flip phone era, it was fine. But the moment phones became tiny computers, Symbian became a nightmare. It was old. It was tangled. Writing new software for it was slow and painful. While Apple and Google built clean, modern systems that developers loved, Nokia's engineers were fighting a codebase held together with tape. And the developers, the outside programmers who build the apps that make a phone worth owning, took one look and walked to the iPhone and to Android instead. Nokia had a backup plan, a modern system called Mego. But it was late. Endlessly, hopelessly late. And underneath the technology was a human problem that was even worse. Nokia had become enormous, and enormous companies grow afraid. Former insiders later described a culture of fear, where middle managers told their bosses only what they wanted to hear. Bad news was buried. Timelines were faked. Different divisions fought each other instead of the real enemy. Engineers who warned that the company was falling behind were treated as disloyal. The people at the top genuinely believed everything was fine, because everyone below them was too frightened to say otherwise. A company of tens of thousands of brilliant people had built a machine perfectly designed to ignore reality. And reality was coming for them fast. Every single month, the iPhone and Android took a little more. And Nokia, the champion, the giant, the pride of a nation, was about to make the single most catastrophic decision in its 150-year history. In 2010, Nokia's board did something it had never done before. It went outside Finland for a leader. It hired an American. His name was Stephen Alop, and he had just come from a senior job at Microsoft. A few months later, in February 2011, an internal memo from Alop leaked to the press. It would become one of the most famous documents in corporate history. In it, Alop told his own employees that Nokia was like a man standing on a burning oil platform in the freezing North Sea. The platform was on fire. The man had a choice. Stand still and burn, or jump into the icy water and hope to survive. Nokia, he said, was standing on a burning platform. It was a brutal, honest diagnosis. And then he made his decision. Nokia would abandon its own software completely. No more Symbian. No more Mego, the modern system it had spent years building. Instead, Nokia would bet its entire future on Microsoft's Windows Phone. Alop's old company. Think about what that meant. He stood in front of the world and told 1 billion customers that every Nokia phone on sale right now was running dead software. So who would buy one? Sales did not just slow. They fell off a cliff. Economists later gave it a name. The Alop effect. He had announced the new phones long before they were ready, and in the gap, customers simply stopped buying Nokia altogether. Some people looked at an ex-Microsoft executive killing Nokia's software to hand the company to Microsoft, and whispered a darker theory. That Alop was a Trojan horse. There has never been proof of that. But it did not matter. Whether by sabotage or by sincere, catastrophic misjudgment, the burning platform was now truly, unstoppably on fire. The new phones finally arrived. They were called Lumia, and running Windows, they were actually good. Beautiful, even. The cameras were incredible. But it was too late. The world had already split into two kingdoms, Apple and Android, and each had hundreds of thousands of apps. Windows Phone had almost none. Customers did not want a lonely third choice. They wanted the phone their friends had. And so the greatest fall in modern business accelerated into freefall. In 2007, Nokia had been worth around $150 billion. Within a few years, more than 90% of that value had simply evaporated. The company that once printed money was now burning through it. Factories that had employed entire Finnish towns went quiet. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. And then, in September 2013, came the ending almost no one could have imagined a decade earlier. Microsoft announced it was buying Nokia's entire phone business. The price was around $7.2 billion. For the company that had once been worth $250 billion, its crown jewel, the phones, was sold for the price of a rounding error. Stephen Alop went back to Microsoft. The deal closed in 2014. And it did not even work for the buyer. Barely a year later, Microsoft admitted defeat, wrote off almost the entire value of what it had bought, around $7.6 billion, and laid off thousands more. The Nokia brand, the name that had once meant the future, was quietly stripped from the phones forever. The most famous name in the history of the mobile phone had been erased from the mobile phone. But here is the strangest part of the whole story. Nokia did not actually die. While the world watched the phones disappear, the rest of Nokia, the boring part, the part that builds the giant network equipment that carries your calls and your data, was still very much alive. Freed from the sinking phone business, that Nokia quietly reinvented itself. It bought a huge rival, Alcatel-Lucent, and became one of the largest telecommunications network companies on the planet. There is a good chance that right now, the signal reaching your phone is passing through Nokia equipment. And the name itself came back too. A Finnish company licensed the Nokia brand and started making phones again, even bringing back a new 3310 for the people who never stopped loving it. So Nokia the company survived. But Nokia the empire, the one that ruled the pocket of every human on earth, that empire is never coming back. And its lesson is the most frightening one in business, because Nokia did not fail by being lazy, or stupid, or poor. It failed while it was winning. It failed because it was so successful that it could not imagine being anything else. It saw the future, built the future, and then buried the future because the present was too profitable to threaten. Every giant that feels untouchable today, every company you think could never fall, is standing exactly where Nokia stood in 2007. Certain. Dominant. And completely blind. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. Who is the next Nokia? Which untouchable giant of today is already quietly burying its own future? If this story pulled you in, subscribe, because there is another empire waiting for you right now, and its collapse is even harder to believe.